And we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We've got an exceptional session for you today. I'm joined by Devon Ferreira. He is the founder of FAS and the former CMO of such establishments as Avalanche, Immutable. He is the person I go to for marketing advice, and now he is here for you, for your enjoyment, to talk through a masterclass on Web3 marketing. We've got a lot to cover. Marketing is a very broad topic, often broader than most people realize. And I'm really excited that we've got Devon's time to help share anything with you guys today. Devon, how you doing? You right?
Anthony, I'm doing really well, thanks. It's good to be here. Appreciate your hospitality and look forward to having a fun discussion.
Very good. Very happy to have you here. This is a LinkedIn Live, as you all know. So anybody who's in here, please, first of all, give us your GMs. Let us know where are you coming from, what projects are you working on, what ecosystem are you part of, so we can try and modify some of the content, give you some relevant examples, or maybe you've got some people from ecosystems that both of us work in. So it would be great to say hi, give us your GMs. Secondly, remember, as it's a LinkedIn Live, you have questions. We want your questions. We want you to ask us questions. So if you have curiosity around anything we're covering, if you had a marketing question that you've always wanted to ask from somebody else in the ecosystem or somebody else working in a different role, ask those questions in the chat. So please do go put your questions in the chat. I'll do my best to multitask with the discussion, and then we'll try and cover those either as we're in flow or at the end of the session. So with no further ado, Devon, for those people who don't know you or haven't come across you yet, could you give us your brief Web3 origin story?
Yeah, no, sure. My career started as an engineer many years ago. I came from South Africa to study mechanical engineering of all things. But about halfway through my career, I pivoted over to marketing and strategy because I was always very enamored by how technology could be used to improve interactions between people and businesses, and how we could use it to do new and interesting things. And so it took me about half my career to figure out, well, that's really strategy and marketing. And so um, I went back to business school, and after that, worked for some big consumer brands like Oakley and Disney in the marketing and strategy area. I ran global digital for Oakley, and it taught me a lot about how people think and the consumer psychology, or just, I'll say consumer. We're all consumers. Just the human psychology related to our choices, not just with products, but the technologies we use. And so I sort of fell into Web3 like most of us did. I was always interested in it as a technologist and an entrepreneur and business person. Um, and in the sort of 2015 to 2018 timeframe, I was doing a lot of bespoke software development. I was leading product and design for a bespoke software company. And again, in this theme of helping large businesses and small figure out how they could capitalize on new and emerging technologies to do new and different things. And when the DeFi summer rolled around in 2020, I started to get really intrigued because having had a background as an engineer, I was always very intimidated by the world of trading and finance. Despite having studied finance and entrepreneurship at UCLA, I never had anybody to kind of mentor me into that space. And so crypto was a fun way to learn how to trade and how markets behaved. And so I was tooling around with it just mostly as an individual when I was approached by the team at Ava Labs, and this was in, let's say, the early summer of 2021. So Web3 was not an industry that I was actively pursuing or trying to build a career in, but this opportunity came across my desk, and the more I learned about the technology, Avalanche, of course, at that time was not well known, really. They had launched on the mainnet the fall before, but things were still very much in the nascent stage. And I was just really intrigued by the challenge of taking this highly complex but incredible technology and finding a way to market that in a way that people could understand. And I've always been attracted to difficult problems, and this definitely is one of the more difficult problems I've tried to tackle in my career. But that really started my journey in Web3. So we had a small but really qualified team when I joined Ava Labs, and over the next couple of years, we grew that marketing group from just a handful of people to a larger cohort of professional marketers. Um, and then after having had the benefit of just seeing the explosive growth that we saw through the fall of 21 and into 22, I got really intrigued by what was going to happen in the next phase. And if you it just kind of rewind in your own mind to the end of 2022, it wasn't a very happy time for crypto. We had gone through a really difficult year. In 2023, it looked like it was going to be a year for building, which it turned out to be. And I started to become really intrigued by the discussion around where adoption was going to come from. So obviously, our history is littered with great examples of good technologies that never really saw light of day or never really matured into a full-fledged industry. And I wanted to continue to do the best I could to drive that adoption. And gaming seemed like an obvious place for that traction to come from.
Everybody wants to work in gaming, right? It's the dream job for everybody, until they realize what gaming actually is.
Well, it was, I've had the benefit of having worked in a variety of, in fact, most sectors I've got some exposure to, but gaming was the one that had eluded me up until the point that I joined Immutable. And so I spent most of 23, most of the time in Sydney, actually, working with a great team and great platform. And obviously, they've seen great success over the last 18 months or so. So that sort of brings us up to the end of last year, when the markets started to look like they would be turning around. And I had a couple of observations. The first one being that the only teams that were left on the field were really the good ones. All the pretenders had fallen by the wayside through the bear market. We used to say bears are for building, right? And so there were a handful of projects that maybe handful is not a fair reflection. A lot of projects, but only good ones left on the park. And it occurred to me that if any of those projects were going to succeed, then they would need to get much better at telling their story. Blockchain and Web3 is a space, especially for our LinkedIn audience. If anybody's spent time really trying to grapple with the ins and outs of it, you really have to mean it. It's not the kind of thing that you can just understand right off the bat. And I think that is perhaps a failure on the part of marketeers writ large, and I include myself in that bucket. But also just the nature of the industry, because it's such a multidimensional and complex field that brings together thinking from so many different disciplines, whether it's economics, cryptography, computer science, the list goes on, right? So I really started thinking about how we were going to make sure that the industry succeeded, and I wanted to make sure that the best projects actually had an opportunity to succeed. Because as we know, and as I always like to say, the best tech doesn't win, the best story wins. We have many great technologies that were unable to succeed just because people weren't able to understand what they are, or to be able to access them really easily. And so FAS, which is a business I've had for a long time and primarily used it as a side vehicle for investments or small advisory projects, I decided to lean into that and see if I could help as many founder CEOs as possible clarify their message, so that the people that we're trying to connect with could actually understand what they're doing. And in that way, do my part to help the industry grow overall. And so that's what I've been doing for most of this year, is working with promising teams and helping to make sure that the best stories actually make their way into the zeitgeist and help to drive things forward for all of us.
Super helpful start. And I mean, one thing that I can observe and give you as feedback is every time that we've spoken, you've always been able to rationalize and break down the ways of communicating or ways of achieving certain things with marketing or reaching an audience that is plain speaking. And I think, you identified at the early blockchain communication, whether this was 2015 Ethereum to 2018, or even in modern day, blockchain teams are very proud of how clever their stuff is, or how sophisticated their technology is. And there's an audience that cares about that too. But there's a wider audience that just does not, and is looking for outcomes or impact, or, like you said, a story to tell around what does using this particular infrastructure or this particular application change to me, for my business, for the world. Please don't tell me about proofs of work and stake. Please don't tell me about consensus. Please don't tell me about elliptic curves. None of these things are reasons why I use any technology. I use technologies for the outcomes. And we're going to get into more of that today. But I strongly believe that Web3 and actually all industries need more plain speaking marketeers. We still need magic. We still need excitement. But at the same time, we still need some of that. And to start us off, maybe, I think this is a fun thing that I grapple with literally every week, is the understanding of non-marketeers as to what marketing is and isn't. And I have my own definition, but I'd love to start with yours. When you talk to others about what is the role of marketing, particularly in a Web3 organization or for Web3 projects, could you help for the non-marketers listening in, or even for the marketers listening in who struggle with this too? What does marketing in Web3 comprise?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question. But I think that we do a great job of complicating things as an industry. I think even the term Web3 marketing is a bit of a misnomer because we have to just focus on the most important word in that phrase to begin with: marketing. As human beings, we've changed very little biologically over the last tens of thousands of years, and somehow we tend to think in our industry that just because we have a new technology, that all of a sudden all that biology goes out the window, but it doesn't. And so, to understand my answer, I think it probably makes sense to just tee it up with my thoughts on how we interact with brands and what the role of brands in our lives are. And I tend to take a very sort of more emotional approach to the conversation, because I believe that one of the big mistakes we make in this industry is we keep talking to the front brain as though that's the front door. And it's not. I firmly believe that people make decisions here in their heart, and then we justify them in our head. So as marketers, we have a hurdle, and that is we've got to get past the bouncer at this nightclub that is the minds of our consumer, right? And that bouncer lives at the top of our brain stem, and it's the lizard brain, and it's asking four very basic, questions about four very basic things. It's like feeding, fighting, fleeing, and you'd have to bleep the next one
Relations with
out.
other people. And
Indeed.
is Bitcoin a scam?
Exactly. Right. So it's like a very emotional topic, and like it is with any new product. And I just think that in our industry, we haven't done a great job of giving people a reason to, or an understanding of how to latch on to something, especially in something that's incredibly difficult to understand. And so the way that I think about marketing, in particular in Web3, is about how we open a door to make it safe for people to self-select and then sort of really invest their own time and energy in understanding this space. But the way I think of marketing, and I'm a big fan of Seth Godin and Bernadette GY, if anybody out there is fans of them. But I like the way that Seth Godin talks about marketing as being nothing other than just a generous offer to solve a problem for an audience that we care about. And I think that we don't do a great job of that in Web3 necessarily. I like to say that we're good at telling stories in bits and pieces. Like, we're great at taking something that's happened and spinning up a bunch of content and creating a lot of noise or rancor around a particular topic. Anybody that's spent any time on crypto Twitter can attest to that. But where we fall short, I think, is in constructing an overall story arc that actually is engaging and accessible for people that are not PhDs. And so that's the storytelling piece that I think we're missing a little bit. And so, what I do now is work closely with founder CEOs and early stage teams to help them understand the principles of storytelling, because it's not a black art, which is how it tends to be viewed sometimes, like, oh, this mysterious thing that only a few people know how to do. And if only we could get these engineers to cotton onto it. It's actually fairly straightforward. And just like coding or any other skill, it's something that can be learned. And so what I do is try to take proven frameworks and ways of thinking and help people to piece these things together in the right way. So coming at it from, a broader understanding of what marketing really is and how to build those connections over time with the people that you're trying to serve. And then also being cognizant of the nuances that do make the Web3-ness of it a little different. And so we could probably get into that a little bit more, but obviously community being central to everything that we're doing there.
Yeah, definitely want to touch on that, and I think that's helpful. I think the build I would put on that is, the people who look from the outside in to marketing probably miss the market part of marketing oftentimes as well. Is it's not a billboard, or it's not a we're not the place that we put messages on posters and we own channels. There's more to it than that in terms of understanding, like you said, the audiences we care about. Why do we care about them? What are they interested in? Who are they buying from today? What are their reference points when they buy or when they consume or when they choose to join a community? What are their beliefs? What are their barriers? What are their satisfiers? And how do we understand that better so that when we then create an offer, a generous offer, as you said, that's a nice way of framing it. When we bring something surprising and exciting to them, are we chiming well with the things that they're looking for and the things that they believe in, or are we rubbing up against some of their challenges and disbeliefs? And then it's ultimately an ability for us to deliver those messages through certain channels and then create feedback loops. Also, And we'll get into this when we get into community. I think the additional challenge of a Web3 marketeer is trying to have a community market for you. And I think that's not unique to Web3 necessarily, right? Because I think if you look at having fan-based marketing or generating fandom as brands or as organizations, if you can have consumer advocates, you have a much stronger base from which to communicate. Your reach can grow organically much faster as a result. So I think that's a big part of it. But we're at storytelling now. So for those who haven't studied the protocols behind the art of storytelling, give us a quick intro to the art of storytelling and what are the protocols that you use?
Yeah, so look, I think the first thing to understand is that storytelling is, again, as our friend Seth Godin says, he calls it the original human technology. And it's something that is deeply aligned with how we operate and how we think and how we retain information. So before diving into how to construct a strong narrative, it's important to understand the role that plays in our lives. And so, stories are a great way to capture information in ways that are easy to remember and to repeat. For years, even before, written languages, storytelling was a way of passing on history or information about how to stay alive or where to find food or what's dangerous and so on. And so storytelling is a really natural part about how we understand the world and how we pass on that understanding. Now, when you think about marketing, the reality is that the majority of marketing takes place in real life, and by real life, I mean in conversations like this, but really word of mouth, right? People sharing information with each other. Yes, we can stimulate those conversations with things like ads or campaigns and activations and what have you, but fundamentally, information flows from person to person, and on a very discrete basis. And when you zoom out, and that happens en masse. So that's really where momentum and brand development and what we think of as marketing, that's where it happens. So with that as a backdrop, the place to begin in constructing a strong story is really in deep empathy for the audience that you're building for. There was a clip that was going around this week on Twitter. I shared it, but it was from the original conversation where Steve Jobs utters that favorite line, that famous line of, you have to start with the experience and work backwards, and that's a line that we use a lot. But even I didn't know the origins of that until I saw this clip earlier this week. And for those that haven't seen it, it's essentially he was giving a talk to almost like an AMA or a town hall, having come back to Apple after being absent for some years. And somebody was challenging him from the audience. They were talking about this open doc standard that at that time Apple was pushing, which Steve eventually killed off. But the question to Steve reminded me a lot of the kinds of challenges and conversations that we see on crypto Twitter, because it was overly focused on this esoteric piece of technology or technology standard. And he was asking about, the relevance of Java and OpenDoc and all of those things, which Steve then responded to by saying, look, that's right. We have to figure out all those pieces, but none of it really matters, because we're not building this for the sake of building it. We're building this because we're trying to add value to people's lives. And so we have to start with that and work backwards from it. And so we can't do that unless we really have deep empathy for the people we're serving. So, storytelling always begins, and at least in the work that I do, with primary research and building those muscles within an organization. As a founder, CEO, or even as an early stage leadership team, storytelling is not something that you can hire an agency to do for you. I mean, sure you could, but it's like, if you don't understand the language, and if you're not part and parcel of that, and if you don't understand the basic elements of how to convey the value of what you're doing to the world, then you're going to fail. And so a lot of what I do is work with founder CEOs to help them build those muscles and give them the structures that you're asking about. The in terms of approaches, I mean, there's a lot of different frameworks. In fact, I was recently talking to a friend about a study that was initiated by the famous author Kurt Vonnegut, who got really curious about different types of stories and how many different types of stories there are in history. And so he convinced some researchers from Australia to do an empirical study, and they took essentially the whole Gutenberg library with 14,000 odd titles, and they did a sentiment analysis on this stuff. And what they discovered, when you map that in a simple XY chart of sentiment over, time, beginning and end of the movie or the book, there's like 6 distinct shapes. And so there's only a handful of types of stories. The most obvious one is one that everybody is very familiar with. Starts off really sad, ends off really happy, rags to riches. We all know that story shape, right? Or, starts off happy-ish, gets bad, gets good, gets bad again, ends up good.
That's
That's
the rom
Slumdog
com. Actually,
Millionaire.
that's the double dip rom com, right? Because the rom com starts with, it's interesting. There's some character development. There's a I love you, you love me moment, and then something tragic happens in the middle of the story, and they go through like half an hour of the movie of things being difficult. Then they reconcile and it's a happy ending, right? That's a straightforward rom com. The double dip rom com is when that everything comes back to, you think it's good again, and then the guy does something stupid again, or lightning strikes the second time.
Right.
I have this every time my wife and I watch a rom-com. It's like, we're at that part in the rom-com now, right? We're at the dip in the story, and it's so obviously
Yeah.
visible and
Yeah.
easy to find. But that's maybe 2 and 3 of your 7 types.
Exactly. So in the craft, they refer to those as, the single dip is man in the hole. Martian is another good example of that. Starts off good, gets bad, ends good. And then the double dip is also called the Cinderella narrative, right? And Slumdog Millionaire, Cinderella, they all fit into that. But interestingly, when you map that against box office, not surprisingly, there's a few shapes to those stories that work better than others. Like, I don't know how many people are excited to go and spend $50 or whatever it costs to go to the movies today, to sit in a flick that starts off really happy, ends up miserable, like the opposite of the rags to riches. Understandably, those those are not the box office, the blockbusters or whatever. And so the reason I share that is because there's a particular framework that I think really works well. It's called the Story Brand Framework, and there are many, but this is one that I found consistently produces good outputs. And so I typically start there and help teams, early stage teams, figure out how to apply that method in a way that is repeatable, so that they can learn how to do that across the organization. It's a technique that I put the whole team through at Ava Labs, and also introduced the crew at Immutable to it. I'm not paid by StoryBrand, and there are other frameworks that work, but that one's an easy one to grasp. It's an easy one to apply, and it creates a pretty strong story arc that resembles something more along the lines of that rags to riches. So it's like, start with the most basic, most accessible story that the audience can understand. And we don't have time to get into the depths of that technique, but I think a couple of key points to pull out. The first one is that. And this is a good place for anybody who's listening to begin, is the realization that there are heroes and there are guides in any good story. You think of Star Wars and you've got Luke Skywalker, who's clearly the hero of the story, but Luke would be useless without some really important guides, and the most important of which being Obi-Wan, right? So I think most technology projects that I work with make the mistake of thinking that their product is the hero of this story. And it really isn't, obviously, right? The hero of the story is the person that you're building it for. And so oftentimes the place we begin is by looking even at messaging on the website. And I created this little AI bot that can read the site and quickly grade that story arc against these components. But a lot of times what we see is there's just an overemphasis on product and not enough on the humans that it serves. Go look at any crypto project. I think probably 1 in 50 will have pictures of human beings on the front page. Mostly it's just going to be a billboard for product features and functions. And it's like cheap, fast, secure, decentralized, like all the stuff that people really couldn't give a crap about.
See it over
right?
and over again. Like, how
Yeah.
everybody listening or watching this right now, go to your website right now and do a quick check for that. It's like, firstly, do you have a picture of a human within at least a half scroll or a full scroll of the main page? Then is the first thing that you come up with next product features. And if it is, you failed the Devon Ferreira test.
Well, the point isn't just to be critical. Actually, if you go to, if you don't mind, I'll just do a quick plug, but there's a useful tool on my website. If you go to fas.ventures/story audit, there's a little tool that I built where you can put your URL in, and it'll produce, it uses an AI agent to produce a pretty comprehensive summary. Somebody told me I actually need to dial back. I'm giving away too much there. But it'll give you some tangible recommendations of quick wins, things you can do to your site today to improve the clarity of that messaging. And so when we're able to position the product as the guide in a much stronger story arc, then I think we're able to build much stronger connections and at least create a safe space and open up a door in the back of people's minds so that all that important technical information eventually earns the opportunity to get to, to continue the analogy, the VIP section, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is really where we want to be.
Nice. Before we jump across, I wonder if we can do just like a micro version of this, because and this could be from a previous project or from something relatable, but I would love to do the short version of a rags to riches story in crypto, or for let's call it a protocol, because people might think, oh, rags to riches, okay, so it starts off with an airdrop and you end up on the moon, right? And the token price goes really high. That is not a rags to riches story for the users of the protocol, right? And so could you give us the short form example of what a brief rags to riches might look like?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's 7 key elements to any good story according to this framework, and it really starts out with a character. So we need to understand who the hero is, and to your point, that rags to riches story would be one in which the product is the hero. The product started off no liquidity, ended up with market cap on the moon. Okay, well that's that's the wrong story, and it's a story that a lot of people are telling, and we can talk about why that's happening as well. But it starts off with a good character. That character has a problem, and we don't talk about what those problems are enough. So a lot of the work that I do with teams early on is really trying to dig in and understand, like, what problems are these people facing in their lives? Because when they come and they use your protocol, whether it's a DEX or some kind of minting tool, or using Blackbird to make a reservation, they have a problem, and they are hiring your product or service to solve that problem for them. And we need to understand what those problems are so that we can do a better job of serving them. One of the criticisms I hear a lot is people who are either, you know I don't know, either they're intimidated to think about how to create the story, or maybe they're so enamored with the technology, but they say, yeah, if you had asked Henry Ford, he would have told you that, if I had asked the customer, they would say they wanted a faster horse and carriage.
They wanted a faster proof of work blockchain.
Yeah. But that also, I think, is a bit of a cop out, because the point is not to ask the customer for the solution. It's to ask the customer what their problems are, and then for you to come up with a solution that they didn't think about that enables them to do something that they couldn't do before. And that is the essence of true innovation. And so, component number 2, the problem, is really important that we understand that. And if we don't, then we can't embark on any kind of good storytelling. So, character has a problem, meets a guide. It's really important that we establish ourselves as a guide in their journey. So their rags to riches story, they've got this problem, they're in a hole, and we need to give them a plan. We can show them how to get up off their feet. Trading Places, another great rags to riches movie, Eddie Murphy, maybe dating myself. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. Teach you about how to tell stories in Web3. But we need to give them a guide, as a guide, we need to give them a plan. And so that plan is grounded in a strong empathy, but it also is coupled with our credibility as technologists. And when we couple empathy with authority, you have credibility. And so any good story is able to do that. So you have a character who has a problem, meets a guide who gives them a plan, right? Which allows them to avoid, and calls them to action. So that's the next step. After you give them the plan, you have the distinct calls to action, things you can go and do right now, right? Every good story should ask or offer or invite somebody to take action and get active in their own rescue and solving that problem. And then reminding them of what would happen when they do take that action. You remind them of the happy ending that they're looking for, because every character is going through a transformation or wants to go through transformation, whether that is, um, moving towards financial self-sovereignty, or whether it's creating that independent wealth you're looking for, or whether it's just owning the item that you buy in the game, right? Whatever that is, being able to support that transformation, avoid the tragic ending. And I think that's an important part too, is really reminding people of, like, the pain of not taking action. So that's the basic flow. And the process for getting there, I think, is fairly straightforward. I think an easy thing to memorize is just 3 questions. And if you can answer these, not only will you have a decent story, but you'll actually have a compelling brand strategy. And the first question is, who are you as a brand? Most teams don't understand who they are. They might have stumbled into a logo design. Once they have something that looks cool and they're willing to put on some merch, they just pivot straight back to product. And realizing that logo is probably the least important aspect of any brand identity. So understanding who they are is paramount. 2, who is your customer? We've spoken at length about empathy, and we could talk about techniques for doing that. And then 3 is when you put those together, who are you to your customer? So if you can answer those 3 questions, who are you? Who is your customer? Who are you to your customer? With those 7 elements I mentioned, you've got a story.
Nice. That's a good start. And how many companies started with a logo design and said, I've got this really good idea. It's going to be like an owl and it's on fire and it's going to do something in Web3. I don't know what it is yet, but that fiery owl is that's going to make a great t-shirt. Honestly, not making it up. That's probably how some NFT project started, but super, super helpful. I want to jump onto media types channels for a minute, because again, I think the modern marketeer has more tools than we've ever had, and oftentimes feel compelled to use as many of them as possible. And that is an urge that I think we have to fight as much as possible. Back to what you said about understanding who's your customer, who are you to them, how do you reach them, how do you communicate with them, what do you want from them? You know, there's the constant urge to say, "Well, I don't have TikTok, and we're not doing enough on Instagram, and should we all be on Facebook or not? You know, what does Farcaster mean for us? Should we be on decentralized social media as well as centralized social media? Should we be paying for football stadium sponsorships? And there's a million different ways through which to reach an audience, and oftentimes very expensive, and oftentimes not very impactful. You know, oftentimes entirely one way. Could you give us your way of looking at or evaluating different media types that are in the arsenal today? And how do you help projects, or how have your previous projects prioritized?
Yeah, I see that a lot. You know, I think people often ask, okay, well, what's the social media strategy, or what's the strategy for TikTok, as you'd mentioned, or Twitter, obviously, which features heavily in any marketing campaign in Web3. And you know, just picking up on the 3 questions we just had, which is who are you, who's your customer, who are you to your customer. The next obvious question is, how do you let them know? And so I think when it comes to that, everything needs to be in service of the narrative, right? So in the same way that we need to reverse things, you don't enter through the front brain, you come through the back, right? In the same way, you don't start with the technology, you start with the customer or the user. And when it comes to the strategy, you don't start with the medium, you start with the narrative. So what we see happen a lot in our industry is people get less so now, but certainly over the last few years, people get really excited about this announcement based marketing strategy, where it's like, all right, well, let's just put out a bunch of big announcements, and then there is
Partnership
reason why
announcement, feature announcement, new keynote announcement. I've got a new hoodie announcement. Like, yeah, it's a lot.
And it's not a bad strategy, but when it lacks structure and when the announcement becomes the point, then what you end up with is these little blips in time where there's no momentum that builds, and there's no brand strength. It's akin to trying to blow up a balloon, where you take a breath, blow in, take another breath, blow in, but you don't pinch the balloon, right? So every time you blow in, the air escapes. Whereas to build that brand, to build that narrative, we have to put everything in context. And so when we think about how we let people know, it really comes down to stories, voices, venues, is the way that I think about it, right? So you've got your overarching narrative, you've got your sub narratives, things that you're trying to share, stories that you're trying to tell. And then it's a matter of saying, okay, well, different stories should be told by different people, right? So talking about how great the technology is probably shouldn't come from the CEO. Well, I mean, it could, but it might be wasted, because of course you think it's great technology, right? That's a story that is much better told by your customers or by somebody else in the community, right? So that's a simple example. So that's the voices part of it. Who's going to say this? Is this the product team talking about the details of the upcoming release? Is this a customer endorsing the product? Is this an opinion leader? I think, you know, giving thought to who's going to lead that narrative, and then you can reinforce it from your other venues. And in the venue, some things are best delivered in the form of a keynote presentation, right? Some things are best delivered in the form of a long form webinar like the one we're doing. Some things are best delivered in the form of a Twitter thread. And so the medium then becomes a slave to the strategy, as opposed to the strategy becoming a slave to the medium. And it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. TikTok is very important. So is Twitter. So is Instagram. So is LinkedIn. So is real life events. They're all important. And so I think, but when you flip things on its head and you come at it from the story standpoint and say, okay, well, how do I best tell the story over the different media and timeframes we have? It becomes a lot easier to structure a compelling campaign. And then, of course, once you've got that story out there, the question becomes, what are you going to do when people react to it? And that is where your funnel design comes in. So okay, you've put the narrative out through these voices and venues. People have now reacted to it, and where do they go? What happens? How do you then nurture them and kind of usher them down a path where they get to a place where they actually understand what you do? They understand the relevance that you have in their lives, and through that process, because of the psychology of investment, they've spent all this time on it and they've walked down this path with you. So now they have a lot invested emotionally and intellectually in what you're doing together. And it means that backtracking to the fork in the road to go down the path with a different product or ecosystem, first of all, means they have to admit to themselves that they have wasted their time, which nobody likes to do. But also they lose time. So that's really how I think about the different media formats.
Nice. And this moves us nicely onto community management, because I think, like you said, if you're communicating messages and people absorb them, at some point you're assuming there's going to be a call to action. Or somebody will become a customer of yours. They will consume an experience, buy a product, take out a license, start building on your protocol, go and check out a particular video, go check out the documentation, whatever it is that you're looking for them to do as part of the journey, wherever they are, that's the next step. I think the interesting thing about Web3 marketing that I think it's probably more acute in Web3. It's not unheard of in others, but the use of community channels, community engagement, by which I mean, Twitter is sort of a broadcast channel. You occasionally get some commenting and some shit posting, but broadly speaking, it's not designed for dialogue. If you then look at Telegram and Discord, for example, and Discord becoming more likely the place where we end up most of the time, these are places where actually you're seeing CEOs of projects interacting daily with the users of those projects, which I think is really potent. Right? When was the last time, other than the odd keynote here and there or the odd bit of interaction, you don't necessarily see Steve Jobs in the comments section? Well, you don't see Steve Jobs at all these days, but seeing Fortune 500 CEOs in the chat, it just doesn't happen, right? And this is something that I think Web3 has developed, taken, and owned. I wouldn't necessarily say advanced, but the requirement is saying actually, we're nothing as a project unless we have our ecosystem. Our ecosystem needs a place to convene. We can't do that physically because we're remote, we're distributed, we're all over the world. So we had to do that digitally. And the place that we have found for doing that is an app that's previously used for gamers coming together to align before going on a quest, or to communicate with each other in game when they weren't using headsets. Right? And this is where we've ended up. This is kind of some part of community management. What's been your experience with the likes of Avalanche or with Immutable or others of, what does good community management look like for a Web3 project?
Yeah, I think that's another $1 million question, and we talk about it a lot in Web3. I think maybe the right way to answer that question is to start with what it's not. Somebody recently asked me, how can we harness our community for growth? And you're going to sense a theme here, but the first thing I did is I said, okay, well, that's the wrong question. This is not about how can you use your community to grow your company. That's not what we're trying to do here. You have to, for this to work, you have to flip it on its head. It's almost like shadows, right? Like you try to catch a shadow, you're never going to catch it. Just try. But what happens when you turn around and walk away? Like it's right there with you, right? So maybe not the best analogy, but the idea that, to make a friend, you have to be a friend. And so community is less about extraction and it's much more about building. I think to your point, we're lucky because the industry is fairly early and the builders are very engaged. And in many cases, especially for the infra side of Web3, a lot of the builders are also the users. And so there's a real interest in understanding things. And we do have these situations where you see, really prominent leaders in Discords and interacting with devs. And I think it's one of the beautiful things about our industry. But if you think about what community really is, and you won't be surprised to know that I come at it again from a very human standpoint. I think that community is really a feeling, isn't it? It's a feeling of having one's own refuge. It's a feeling of belonging, and it's a feeling of it's okay to be here. I've found my people. I'm in a safe place where I can speak my mind or ask questions, and I'm with people I like and people like me. And that's not something that you can enforce or ensure through a particular technique. You have to, it's a bit like growing a bacteria. Like you got to create the right environments and then seed it and then let it take on a life of its own. And if you think about the smallest unit of community, right, we tend to think of communities as large organizations, and indeed that's what the successful ones grow to be. But the smallest unit of community is you and I. It's what's happening right here. This is where community is built. If you think about, I'm very proud of what we did with the Avalanche Summit in 2021, the first ever Avalanche Summit. And
one of the
I
coolest of
think
it. I've looked on with such envy at that event. It was hands down. It was a first of a kind type of event in Web3. I think before previously we were just doing we were attending consensus and we were maybe doing a little bit of a side event or a party or something like that. You guys said nope, screw it. We are going to create nothing but, and we're going to do it in the most engaging and fun way. And honestly, I don't think it's been topped yet.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I think there's a lot of great events out there, but what I think made that particularly successful for us was this idea that it was less about self-interest and it was more about social interest. How can we create environments for people to connect and to have really good experiences together? Because nobody comes back from a conference and says, "Oh my God, that talk on day 3 in the afternoon just changed my life." I mean, sometimes that happens. No disrespect to our speakers, but really what people remember is the experiences that they had, those unexpected moments where they were sitting there chatting, having a really in-depth conversation with somebody they never thought they would meet, learning about something they never thought they would learn about, and then out of the corner of their eye, they saw 2 flamenco dancers right there. That's a moment that they'll remember, and that's a moment that then cements that conversation that they were just having. Oh, remember when we were talking about this thing, and then these guys showed up and started to build a human tower? You know, creating moments like that. We did it deliberately to allow people to forge these memories and make these connections in a way that's going to stick, right? So the psychologists talk about this notion of what fires together wires together. When we stimulate emotional experiences, it burns those images in our mind. Think of the young girl who gets into a sleeping bag and gets bitten by a spider on her first camping trip. What do you think she's thinking about for the rest of her life every time she gets into a sleeping bag, right? So how can we engineer environments where people can have those moments of togetherness and have that feeling of like, I've found my people. So for us to really build community, we must do things for the community that are selfless. We must give away more than we're getting, and when we do that, it's like when we give it away, we get more of it back. And I think that's a principle that you see not just in Web3, but go back to the most obvious and famous example of Red Bull. When I was at Oakley, I was really inspired a lot by the Red Bull marketing. And when I first got to Oakley, we were jostling with this notion of, well, what should be on the website? Should it be about brand or should it be about commerce? Should we push discounts on backpacks or should we have videos of skaters? And it's really both, because it's about the content that you provide. And if you look at the content that Red Bull provides, they never talk about their product. They don't need to, because they're there for the audience who then self-discovers. And besides the fact that the product doesn't belong to them, we won't talk about that. But the idea that the more you give the community, the more they're going to give you back. And so everything that we did at Avalanche, whether it was the events we hosted in Berlin, or whether it was the summit, or whether it was the forums we built online, it was all about how can we serve this community, because when you do that, you engender a lot of commitment in reverse. And now we just have to figure out how to kind of break down the barriers and reduce some of the tribalism that exists in Web3 writ large. I think for us to be able to really capitalize on this technology as an industry.
Love that. And in the interest of time, I want to just jump onto something I think is, I don't call it a taboo topic, but it's a topic that's caused me some sense of frustration. I think it's probably misrepresented in some cases, and that's the role of what's called key opinion leaders, KOLs, or content creators, or whatever you care to call it. I think it's almost taken as a given now that if you are to be successful as a Web3 project, you must bring on board key opinion leaders. You must have a certain number of KOLs on your roster who are amplifying your message. And that's interesting because I think when you look at it if you look at the project from a pure tokenomics or investor perspective, you'll see people who are experienced crypto influencers saying this is the next coin that you should be buying. And as a result, people who follow that person will then go and speculatively invest in a particular coin that, I guess, in some short term helps to boost, firstly, the KOLs bags that they have themselves, and secondly, kind of helps to boost the token price of a particular project, which, from a market perspective, people may suspect, well, that means success. There's been a lot of buying and purchasing there. I do not stand behind that thesis. I see huge value in content creators. For example, if you're looking as infrastructure or even as a SaaS company, looking to onboard developers interested in building new and interesting applications, there are very many developer content creators, developer advocates, peer content creators who do speed builds for particular applications using particular types of software. That could be hugely more powerful in terms of actually contributing code to your ecosystem as opposed to contributing views or contributing bag holders. I wonder if you have a particular view on KOLs from your time at some of your previous projects and your currents. And do you see it as an essential item, or do you see this as maybe a little bit of crypto bad habits?
I mean, I think it's both. KOLs, I think, is a misused word. If we break it down, the key opinion leaders. I mean, obviously those people exist, and it's good to have key opinion leaders on your side and helping to push your narratives. I think the challenge is we've already spoken about the fact that if you don't have a strong story, then what it ends up being is just blatant shilling of bag holders. And I think that KOLs is obviously a spectrum, and there's different types of leaders. The reality is we as humans are very very much subject to the effects of mimesis, and we certainly do look up to people with large audiences or people that have accomplished great things in their lives, and some people's voices are louder and more influential than others. And I think any project should spend time really thinking about what KOLs means to them. Unfortunately, KOLs has become a bit of a four-letter word because in the absence of good narrative, in the absence of good strategy, we end up just having bag holders that are shilling things. In the worst cases, it's pump and dump. But even in other cases, it's more like everybody out there like arguing about why A is better than B, as opposed to why we can solve problems together if we're thoughtful about it. So I think we can't tar all KOLs with the same brush. I think that it's up to projects to sit down and think about the fact that top of mind is tip of tongue, right? So how do we make our project top of mind? We should solicit or invite people with a big audience who care about the same things that we care about. We should invite them in to learn more. And we should encourage authentic, accurate conversations about problems and solutions. And if you want to stay in that zone, then yes, I think a KOL strategy is an important part about how you share your message with your audience. But no, I mean, as you might imagine, I'm definitely very much against shilling tokens for the sake of it.
Yeah, and I think the term KOL has become vastly bastardized. I think content creator for me is a more balanced word because content creator takes on many forms. Right? You have
actually,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, and sorry to interrupt, but I just thinking about KOL is it's often a term reserved for those with really public voices, but there are many I don't know, we can call them silent KOLs, people that have a strong hand in smaller communities. I'm thinking about institutional liquid funds, people that are holding a lot of tokens, and so there are very prominent voices in those communities that are not necessarily vocal on public fora like Twitter, but that are very influential and set the tone for others that are making institutional acquisition of these digital assets that they look to as a leader. And so I think it's important to identify on the product side, but also on the institutional side, those people that you need to build a relationship with that can help to share the value that you're creating, and in that way, help to propagate the right messaging into the right communities. But content creation is definitely a big part of that.
Yeah, it's trying to find those content creators that align with your audience, as opposed to those who will amplify your hype cycle. Which again, back to your point around, announcement by announcement, instant and regular caffeination of your audience. The same is going to happen if you create content that creates kind of little dopamine hits of activity. Great. If you create content that allows people to engage with your business, your product, your application longer term, and grow that through word of mouth, you'll be in a different space. Maybe the urgency of the token price of your project may be something that you feel concerned about. But long term, if we're talking about building reliably and in a way that the SEC probably isn't going to knock on your door for, you've got some choices. Onto the next, I wanted to do a quick fire round, if I may, because I think the term narrative has crept into Web3. And the term narrative has existed in marketing for a long time, but the term narrative has almost replaced sector or industry focus or use case. And so nowadays, narrative is an investment thesis without proof. For me, that's my definition of the word narrative. It's somebody says, I'm going to put money into this because I think it's hypey, as opposed to saying, I'm going to invest behind Coca-Cola because I think consumer goods at this point in time and the products they're selling have a large audience and they're expanding well internationally. Right? Different ends of the spectrum. I'm not here to argue with the term narrative. I'm here to throw a little bit of shade on it. But what I want to do is to take some of the narratives or some of the domains of interest around Web3, and I want your 1 to 2 sentence version on whether you think these have strong potential or whether they're being misrepresented today. And so we're going to go through 4 examples: AI, real world assets, dApps, and meme coins. And I want to give your sense of whether you think the marketing in these spaces is appropriate right now, and whether you genuinely believe in the use case. Does that sound good?
Let's do it.
All right. So let's start with the big one, the one that's doing the rounds at the moment: AI, artificial intelligence. How do you feel about this as a narrative right now?
I'm actually very bullish on AI x crypto because, first of all, I don't think we can argue with the rise of artificial intelligence and the role that it plays in our daily lives. I think that we've got a real problem in that sector where power and resources are accumulating around a very small set of the abundant few, we could call them, right? And I think that's not good. It's not good for us as consumers. It's not good for the industry. And so I think that there's a really strong argument for the decentralization of resources and control. But also from a supply side, there are just a lot of builders out there who don't have access to the resources that they need. You can go and talk to researchers at really prominent institutions, well-funded institutions, and prominent researchers that are actually building the future of AI. And for them to get access to basic things like compute, very, very difficult. They have to wait a month or 2 at least, and it's incredibly expensive. So I think decentralization and access to compute, blockchain is perfectly suited to aggregate excess compute and to provide an economic mechanism to make sure that all parties that are participating are justly rewarded. So it's a fantastic use case. I think that there's a tremendous amount of hype in the industry. And again, I think it comes back to people not doing a great job of actually telling their story. First of all, blockchain is really complicated. AI is really complicated. You put them together, complicated squared. Like, I mean, so, but there's three real problems in AI. The first is like the decentralized, being able to aggregate compute. The second is making sure that we can verify that the results we're getting back are coming from the models and the sources we think that they're coming from. And blockchain can help with that verification. And then third is data privacy. So, you're sharing data with OpenAI about your Twitter analytics or about your weight loss schedule. There's a lot of private information that you're sharing. And how can we be, sure that it's secure and is being protected? And I think blockchain can help with that as well. So
100%.
I think we've got
or do it
more
a
to
different
do.
way. Or do it in the way where you're actually not sharing any sensitive data at all. And okay, small plug for Midnight here, but the exact way that we're looking at it is have systems query your data set without actually looking or sharing or moving the data. While retaining privacy opens up a whole world for monetization or data access. I'm going to move on to the second one. And I didn't check your use of semicolons there, but I'm sure that was more than 2 sentences. So we're going to accelerate the last 3 in the interest of time. Real world assets. I have a problem with this in just the term real world, but real world assets, how are you feeling about that as a narrative?
Look, I'm bullish. I'm long on RWAs. I think that there's a lot of trapped capital. There's GDP is essentially the velocity of money times the supply of money, and I think blockchain really increases velocity. There's a lot of money tied up in intermediaries and capital markets that I think blockchain releases, and it provides more utility. The ability to tokenize real world assets not only makes it more accessible to a lot of people, but it also gives you the ability to drive further utility. So being able to, for example, do liquid staking on tokenized assets and then earn further utility downstream and use them in new and different ways. So I think that this is my second sentence. I think that from a regulatory standpoint, we're still pretty early, right? And I think that as we get more regulatory clarity, we'll see more money flow into those sectors. But just look at the inflows for BTC ETFs, and there's no doubt that that's inevitable. It's just a matter of time, and it's going to be slowly, and then all at once.
Love that. I'm going to pick one last one. Meme coins. How are you feeling about meme coins?
You can't talk about meme coins without talking about community. I think community coins might be a better way of describing them. In the absence of being able to understand what you're doing or to be able to drive real utility because some of the basic underlying pieces are still being built or some of the traction is not there, meme coins are a great first product. It's basically a badge. It's a way of saying that I'm in this club, and people like to self-identify. And if you can build some cool culture around it, it creates a great way of connecting people that weren't really connected before. That's the positive side of meme coins. I spoke to Raj Gokal about it a month ago at Medici. He said there was like 14,000 meme coins being created on Sol every single day. That number I think has gone up to like 20,000 now. So there's definitely an appetite. Things like Pump.Fun have shown us that not only can you make a financially productive product, they're accruing about $500,000 in fees every day, more than Uniswap. So meme coins are definitely a thing. And I don't think we can dismiss them out of hand, but there's obviously an ugly side to it, just like there's an ugly side to all interesting ideas.
Very nice and concise summary. I heard it described as a way of taking ideas and matching them with liquidity, which I think is interesting, albeit the longevity of those ideas is probably the challenge. We are at time, and I have just time for one more question for you, Devon, before we close. I ask everybody this, and I'm really interested in your perspective. I think I know what the answer might be, but I'm interested in your take. What do you think more is needed to see wider use of Web3 technology?
Well, I think in no specific order, there's a short list of things, but the first one that comes to mind for me is we need greater regulatory clarity. I think with the FIT21 bill making its way through the US legislature, that's going to help to create some guardrails. And we can argue about what good rules or bad rules look like, but I think just having some rules so that everybody knows what game we're playing, I think is going to be really important. So I think that's the one thing that needs to happen. I think we need to see the industry focus a little bit more on, the experiences. Going back to the comment that I made earlier about Steve Jobs' famous remark, like I still think we're overly focused on the technology and overly focused on the near-term financialization of that technology, even in advance of delivering real value. So I think we need to be a little honest with ourselves and turn ourselves outside in as builders and really start to think more about what are we creating to solve a real problem for users. And so and then the third thing, I think we just need time. I think that this stuff is inevitable. I think it's complicated. There's a lot that has to be built, but I think that time is really mostly what we need for this to become just the way we do things. Nobody knows whether this is being, going through Akamai or some other CDN, or whether it's Cloudflare on the back end, or what AWS components are being used to support this live stream. And I think right now we're just a bit too focused on the componentry and less on how it changes people's lives. But we're getting there. We're getting there slowly.
There we go. Regulatory clarity, focus on the user and the story, and a little bit of time, and we'll get there. I'm going to put up the link for those people who are in the chat asking about the story audit, the story bot. So faz.ventures/story audit. If you want to go and check that out. Devon, thank you so much for building that. Thank you for sharing that with the community. And thanks for sharing your time with us today. As I said, I often go to Devon for guidance when things are hard or when I'm struggling with a particular problem, and I wouldn't be the marketer I am today without your help, Devon. So thank you so much for sharing your experience with me. Thank you for sharing your experience with the community listening in, and have a safe day. and see you soon.
Thank you for those kind words. It's a pleasure to be here, Anthony, and always happy to catch up, even if it's not on screen. So you guys have a great day.
Awesome. Stay safe out there.